After over 170 hours of making the spice flow on Arrakis, I've come to the conclusion that the endgame might actually have been intentionally designed to be toxic. And it actually has very little to do with the fact that the endgame experience has a whole lot of PvP in it. No, it's actually something a bit less obvious and more insidious. It's surrounding the way that relationships, guilds, the faction system, and bases are intentionally set up by the developers based off of some of the questions they answered for me in a recent slew of questions I sent to them over Discord. Let me try to do my best to explain here. Now, if you guys don't know much about the endgame for Dune Awakening, it's centered around the Deep Desert, which is this much bigger open, server-meshed area of the game that's separate from the Haga PvE basin, where you're doing most of the quest lines and story. It's a 500 square kilometer area of open sand and rock islands, rich in spice and the worms that produce it. But not all of the Deep Desert is PvP any longer like it was in the beginning. Now it's split half PvE and half PvP, with the most valuable stuff being in the PvP section, which is the northmost, deepest part of the desert. But it's not just about collecting spice. The focus is actually surrounding what's called the Landsraad, which is a group of houses in the universe of Dune that you perform tasks for in order to basically do a bingo card sheet across where you will win the week as either Atreides or Harkonnen, depending on which faction you've aligned yourself with. The winning faction gets to vote depending on how much voting power their guild has on which type of benefit they want to have that week, and they get 3 random benefits. It could be a percentage off of armor or exclusive armor from the Emperor, or it could be even a big boost in experience to get all of your teammates up to a higher level, making them a little bit more powerful the following week against the other faction. Now, based off of what the developers have said and what I've personally experienced, it's clear that a lot of this endgame experience is meant to be played with a group of friends. Now, you can do it solo, and there are people out there even running entire operations by themselves using a sandcrawler, which is insane, but generally speaking, you need to go into the Deep Desert with support if you want to get out alive, because you're often going to run into other players if you're going into the more valuable area. But not even that, the dungeon-esque testing stations, which are primarily PvE focused, are also designed around groups, as trying to go in there solo will often get you killed if you go up against a wave type of testing station where they keep sending higher and higher, more OP NPCs against you until you die. But there's a pretty big caveat to this. There is friendly fire, except for the people within your party, which is limited to 4. It is possible to accidentally kill members of your guild or even members of your faction, and it's very hard to identify who's who, especially given that you're able to wear the skins of the enemy faction if you're able to find out how to unlock it, which a lot of people have done. And when asked whether or not this was intentional game design, they came back to me with yes indeed, they want the opportunity for people to betray you. So this is the first sign that the endgame is designed to be a bit toxic, but this is not the only one. So this is a small but important part. Now, there is a good part of doing it this way, and that's to prevent zerging. If there was no friendly fire and everybody was in the same party, it's possible for you to overpower other groups of people just by numbers, and if you played EVE Online, you'll know that it becomes very much a numbers game as opposed to a game about skill and tactics, which is not a lot of fun for smaller groups of people. So it does require a lot more coordination between teammates in order to make sure people aren't shooting each other. And as an effect, it does in fact stop zerging from happening too much, though it can still happen. And honestly, this isn't the part that I'm most concerned about. I actually get this part of the game design. The part that's just a little bit confusing is how we're supposed to align ourselves with a faction, but in the end game experience, it really doesn't matter at all, because you're just shooting everybody on sight anyway. There's no benefit or downside to shooting members of your own faction. If you're able to get more voting power in the week for the Landsraad to choose what you want of the 3 options, it doesn't necessarily give you any more unique power over the other guilds within the faction anyway. So it's a bit of a strange cognitive dissonance for this game's design to have factions, but have factions that don't matter. But that's not inherently toxic, it's just a strange design choice. All right, now we've meandered a little bit, but this is all I think important context for the next thing I want to talk about, which is to do with guilds and the way that permissions and bases are all set up. So a big and very important part of the endgame experience is base building. You need to be able to build a forward operating base within the deep desert every single week in order to return your spice to and start processing it. And generally, these bases need to be filled with all tier 6 equipment, at least the tier 6 processor for spice, because it's the most efficient for getting the most spice out of the sand that you harvest. And because the deep desert requires a lot of group play and these Mark 6 items are so expensive, the design of the game seems to be centered around you working together to build this stuff and using the base together in order to process it together. And a little bit more context here as well, while party sizes are limited to 4, the size of a guild can be up to 32. So 32 people are presumably supposed to be working together in the deep desert to collect spice or do other various activities. And it works like you might expect. The guild is set up with permission systems so that you can have guild members, officers, and owners so that, you can separate general members from people you trust to be able to recruit people and have access to the guild's coffers. And bases too are set up in a similar tiered fashion. Through the access console of your base, you're able to set permissions based on a number of levels. You can go from public, where anybody can get in your base, all the way to just co-owner or just yourself. With presumably the idea being that you can allow access to some things for the guild, but restrict valuable items from the majority so that things that are really important don't just go missing. At least that would be the assumption you might make. That's certainly the assumption that I made based off the way that the system's designed, but the way it actually plays out doesn't work that way at all. So here's the first problem. Now, if you go into any of your items inside of your base, any of your equipment, your manufacturers, or your processors, you'll notice that you can set up circuits. And this allows you to say what goes into a thing and what comes out of a thing. So if you've got a box and you want to make sure that you only deposit sand in there and it produces spice, and then that spice goes into a separate box, you can say have input come from circuit 1 from the drop-down menu and output go to circuit 2. It's like a really basic satisfactory type of system where instead of conveyor belts, you're just using a drop-down menu to select where things are coming from and where things are going. It sounds pretty simple and a good way to organize your base, right? But here's the big issue. If you give any level of access to a refinery or a processor to a member of your guild or party or a friend, even though they don't have access to, say, storage boxes with valuable equipment in it, there is no way to stop them from going to the drop-down menu, guessing which circuit the valuables are on, and just processing out the materials that they want to steal from your base. So say they can go into the spice refinery, and even though they don't have access to the spice, they can change the input and output to get the melange to go where they want it to go and start stealing the stuff directly from your base. Or say, for example, you only want to allow people to process spice or to repair equipment or to produce, new items that you may lose in the deep desert, like suspensor belts. If you unlock that and you lock all of the access to the valuables that create those items, you can still just keep producing valuable items over and over again and then break them down and get those items out anyway. So again, to reiterate here, regardless of how you set up guild permissions or permissions for your base, if you share access to any refinery, anything that makes stuff or stores stuff, there is a way to get all of the stuff from your base out of it because of the way that you can swap circuits around. And here's the real kicker. If you've played the game before and you've noticed the loading screen, you might have noticed the little tips it pops up on the bottom. And one of those tips actually says that there's an activity log you can go to find out if your base has gone missing and a vehicle has gone missing. Like, you can find out who has actually done the destruction and perhaps taken the thing that has gone missing. But you can't actually track who's done anything in your base. There is no log for who's taken things from or deposited things into your base. So there's activity logs for everything else, but not for that. Now, when I asked them about this little loophole and this problem with the circuit system in the game's design, the response I got back is that this is an intentional gameplay design and they have no plans to adjust the permission system or the log system in order to be able to track who's taking what and who's depositing what. And again, this comes back to their idea that they want people to be able to betray you. And I've got an idea where this is coming from. If you've ever heard about EVE Online, you may have heard about the incredible legendary stories of people working their way up the ladder of an EVE org and stealing everything from the coffers. Generally speaking though, those people, they are found out. We know who those people are. There's a way to track that. And those people are kicked out of the guild after it happens. But The problem with the way that Dune is designed is that there's no way to find out who's doing it. And here's the actual result of what happens when you don't have a way to track who's doing what. It's pretty easy to figure out if you just think about it for a moment. When you can't track who's doing what, and you can't hold anybody accountable for what's happening, people just are human and they start pointing fingers. They start growing suspicious of one another. They start setting up traps, DMing each other, trying to figure out who's doing what. But without any way to really prove who's doing the stealing, it just comes down to people getting angrier and more suspicious. And the effect is, for at least my Armco community, as that people have started splitting off into their own bases. Now, originally you guys might have seen my video where I created this really extravagant and beautiful guild base with this idea that we would work together to build up this base. The thing is, it never really worked out because stuff kept going missing from the guild base. Worse, every other member of the guild who had set up any kind of sharing with other members would also have this same problem happening. Things would start to go missing, and it got to the point where we realized that this was malicious and intentional. Someone was doing this within our guild, intentionally stealing stuff and taking advantage of our goodwill of trying to work together. And while I do understand that this may have been intentionally designed in order to prevent surging in the deep desert, the actual effect of this, in at least my community, has been increased toxicity, suspicion, people leaving, people not wanting to work together, or not wanting to play the game anymore. And while you could dismiss this as just that people are getting bored of the game after playing it for a while, I've got messages exactly to this effect for why people have stopped playing. In my view then, without any way to hold anybody responsible definitively, and leaving it always open to finger pointing without any way to draw any real conclusions, this game is actually quite antithetical to a gaming community if you want to choose it as a game to get together to play. Because eventually you're going to have a bad apple and people are going to start to break down in trust, and it's going to affect your gaming community as a whole. I personally heavily disagree with this game's design. It is designed to be toxic. Betrayal is definitely a game mechanic, but without having any way to hold somebody responsible, I don't think it's actually that good of a game mechanic. In my view, if you want people to stick around for this game, once a game gets beyond its PvE experience and it gets beyond the single player experience, what's left is community building. And if you've designed a game to be inherently toxic to communities, well, then in the end, the game's going to gradually die off until all that's left are very toxic people who eventually get bored because there's nobody left to take advantage of. I'm not saying to get rid of the idea of betrayal. I don't want a goody two-shoes, no friendly fire game. I think that that's actually a pretty cool design element of the endgame for Dune Awakening. All I'm saying is that there needs to be some way for us to hold people accountable. This permission system needs to make sense. Friendly fire needs to make sense. The faction system needs to matter a little bit more than it does. Logs need to allow us to hold people accountable. It won't stop us from being betrayed. It won't stop social engineering like what happens in EVE Online, but it does allow us to have some kind of conclusion to a betrayal, to know that we know who's betrayed us and we've gotten rid of them and we can move on to the next potential betrayal. And by the way, this is online gaming, so literally the same person could just sign up again with a different account, get into our guild, do the whole thing again, and use a voice modifier, and we probably wouldn't know. Look, I would give Funcom and the developers behind Dune Awakening the benefit of the doubt if I could, but I can't because they responded and they told me exactly what I've told you here. This is intentional gameplay design, and my view on this is that it's toxic and antithetical to communities in the long run. So that's my take on this. I hope that they seriously reconsider this, because until they do, at least for my community, we're going to have to be extremely suspicious of everybody, and I suspect people are going to keep falling off until nobody wants to play the game anymore and we just got to move on to something else. Which is an absolute shame because I still love Dune Awakening and I still see so much potential in this world. The story was so good, the world building is so good, I like the mechanics, but this endgame design, guys, yeah. Anyway, I want to hear your guys' thoughts. Do you see this the way that I do, or do you see it a different way? Let me know down in the comment section below. I want to know. Let's start this discussion. I hope this game continues to grow, continues to get better, makes the end game better, because I would love to keep making more content on this. Anyway, that's it for now. Hope to see you in the next one.